You have already been assessed. Not maybe. Not if you have spent enough time near swans, if you have walked past a swan lake more than a handful of times, if you have stood at the edge of that water for any length of time, if you have ever approached a swan deliberately or had one approach you. The assessment happened. It started before you reached the water. It may have started before you came into view. And the outcome of that assessment is sitting in the swan's memory right now, attached to whatever combination of features it uses to identify you, waiting to be retrieved the next time you appear. Most people who visit lakes with swans have no idea this is happening. They see a bird on the water. They see it react or not react to their approach. They interpret the reaction in human terms: friendly, unfriendly, tame, wild, and they move on. What they do not see is the process running underneath the reaction. The data collection, the categorization, the classification that determines not just how the swan responded that day, but how it will respond every subsequent time that specific person appears at that specific water. Swans are not reading your intentions. They are doing something more interesting and more precise than that. They are reading your behavior, and from your behavior, they are building a model of what you are likely to do next. That model is what determines how they treat you, not who you are in any sense you would recognize, not what you intend, what you have done consistently, over time, in their presence. That is the thing they are measuring. And they are measuring it with a precision that most people, standing at the edge of a lake throwing bread, never suspect. Stay until the end, because the last section covers what happens when a swan's model of you turns out to be wrong in either direction, and the behavioral consequences of that miscalculation are something that nobody who has witnessed them forgets easily. Number 1. The first 3 seconds. What the swan is doing before you know it has seen you. A mute swan on open water has a visual field that covers approximately 300 degrees. The placement of the eyes on the sides of the head means that the only area not covered by at least one eye is a narrow cone directly behind the bird. Directly in front, there is a zone of binocular overlap where both eyes converge, giving the bird depth perception comparable to a forward-facing predator. The rest of the field is monocular, wide, and continuously scanned. What this means in practical terms is that a mute swan sitting on a lake has been aware of your approach significantly earlier than you registered that it was looking at you. The moment you entered its visual field, which at open water on a calm day can be a considerable distance, the swan began processing. The first assessment is categorical. Is this a known type of object or an unknown one? Large bipedal animal moving on 2 legs at a particular pace, particular gait, particular rhythm. The swan has a template for this: humans. The template is not neutral. It is weighted by every previous encounter with humans that this swan has had, and by whatever the outcomes of those encounters were. The second assessment begins immediately after the first. Is this a known individual? Not just a human, but this human. The specific combination of size, movement pattern, gait signature, and if the distance is close enough, facial features and clothing color that this individual presents. Researchers studying individual recognition in mute swans at long-term field sites have used the established framework of avian individual recognition, developed most rigorously in crow and corvid research, to examine how swans categorize familiar versus unfamiliar humans. The results are consistent with what is found across highly social, long-lived bird species. Individual humans are recognized. The recognition is stable across time, and the behavioral response to a recognized individual differs measurably and specifically from the response to an unfamiliar person of equivalent size and behavior. All of this happens in the first seconds of your approach, before you have done anything, before you have made any gesture or produced any sound. The history you have with this bird, or the absence of any history, is already shaping what is about to happen. Number 2. What the swan is actually measuring, and why intentions are irrelevant. Here is the thing that most people find uncomfortable when they hear it clearly stated. The swan does not care what you mean to do. It cannot access your intentions. It has no mechanism for reading the internal state that precedes your behavior. What it has, and what it uses with considerable precision, is a record of what you have actually done, in its presence, over the history of your encounters with it. This is not a limitation. It is a more reliable system than intention reading would be, if intention reading were possible. Behavior is what actually affects the swan. Behavior is what the swan has to predict in order to make correct survival decisions. And behavior, over repeated observations, is a more reliable predictor of future behavior than any internal state the observer might claim to have. What the swan is measuring, specifically, is a behavioral profile. It is built from multiple dimensions simultaneously. Approach distance and speed. How close do you come before stopping? Do you stop consistently at the same distance, or does the distance vary? Do you move toward the bird directly, or do you approach at an oblique angle that is less threatening? Do you accelerate as you approach, which reads as pursuit, or maintain a consistent speed, which reads as transit, posture, and orientation? Do you face the bird directly, which reads as attention and potential challenge, or do you orient partially away, which reads as non-threatening? Do you crouch, which reduces your apparent size? Do you stand at full height and face forward, which in large animal behavioral terms is the posture of something assessing whether to engage? Duration and frequency. How long do you stay? How often do you come? Do you appear at consistent times, which allows the swan to build a predictive model of your schedule? Or do you appear randomly, which makes you harder to model, and therefore higher in uncertainty? Response to the swan's signals. When the swan raises its head, do you stop? When it produces a warning call, do you step back? When it moves toward you in a way that is not food-seeking, do you give ground? Or do you continue forward, ignoring the signals, which tells the swan that its communication system does not work on you, which is a significant piece of negative information? Every visit, every approach, every interaction is adding data points to this profile. The profile is being updated continuously. And the classification that comes out of it, safe, neutral, threatening, unpredictable, determines every subsequent behavioral decision the swan makes when you appear. Your intentions are not in this profile. Your behavior is. The person who genuinely loves swans but approaches fast, faces directly, stops too close, and ignores the swan's communication signals is building a threatening profile. The person who has no particular feelings about swans but happens to walk the same path at the same time every morning, stopping at the same comfortable distance, facing the water obliquely, responding to the swan's signals by giving space, is building a safe profile. The swan cannot see the difference in what those two people feel. It can see exactly the difference in what they do. Number 3. The specific moment the assessment shifts. What it looks like from the outside. There is a point in the development of a relationship between a human and a swan where the classification changes, where the accumulated behavioral data crosses whatever threshold the system uses, and the swan's default response to that person's presence shifts from wary to neutral, or from neutral to something that functionally resembles ease. What does that moment look like? It does not look like anything to most people. That is the honest answer. The shift does not announce itself. The swan does not do something new. It stops doing something old. The slight head elevation that was present before is absent. The fractional repositioning that maintained a specific gap between the bird and the approaching person stops happening. The continuous orientation that kept the person in the swan's primary visual field without the person noticing it relaxes. What you see, if you are paying close enough attention, is a bird that has stopped running the active assessment protocol. It is still aware of you. It has not reclassified you as furniture. But you have been moved from the category that requires continuous monitoring to the category that requires only background awareness. The behavioral researchers' term for this is threat habituation. But that phrase flattens something that is actually more specific. The swan has not simply stopped caring about humans in general. it has not become less vigilant overall. It has made a specific judgment about a specific individual based on specific data, and it has updated the classification accordingly. Other humans standing at the same lake at the same time get the standard response: the raised head, the maintained distance, the ongoing assessment. The familiar human gets something different. Not warmth, not in any sense that maps onto human warmth. The absence of the assessment. The return to what the swan does when nothing requires active attention. That differential response, visible if you know what to look for, is the clearest evidence available that what has happened between that person and that swan is not habituation to humans in general. It is recognition of an individual. And it is the closest thing to a relationship that the swan's behavioral system is designed to produce. Number 4. When the model breaks down, what happens when a swan's assessment of you is wrong? The assessment system is accurate because it is conservative. It changes classifications slowly. It requires substantial evidence to move a person from one category to another. It is heavily weighted toward maintaining threat vigilance rather than extending trust. This conservatism produces errors in both directions. The first type of error is the false positive. The swan has classified someone as safe based on a history of non-threatening behavior, and that person does something that the classification predicted they would not do. Approaches the nest, picks up a signet, makes a sudden movement that reads as strike preparation. The behavioral prediction fails. What happens next is documented consistently across field research. The swan's response to a false positive, to a trusted individual behaving unexpectedly, is not proportional. It is not the measured, graduated response that an unknown, low-threat individual would receive. It is immediate, escalated, and in many observed cases more intense than the response to an outright stranger. The intensity reflects the degree to which the classification was wrong. A bird that had classified you as safe and now experiences you as threatening has experienced a larger prediction error than a bird that was already maintaining threat vigilance. The response magnitude tracks the prediction error, not the absolute threat level. This is the explanation for something that confuses people regularly at Swan Lakes. The bird that seemed completely comfortable with someone, that had allowed close approach for months without any aggression, that had apparently settled into a stable, easy relationship with a regular visitor, suddenly attacking that person with an intensity that seems wildly disproportionate to whatever triggered it. The person did something that broke the model. The model correction was immediate and severe. The second type of error is the false negative. The swan has classified someone as a threat based on a history of threatening behavior, and the person has genuinely changed their approach. They now come slowly. They stop at appropriate distances. They respond to the swan's signals. They have done everything that should build a safe profile. The reclassification is much slower than the initial classification was. Far slower. The system that moves a person from unknown to safe over months of consistent, non-threatening behavior requires a considerably longer period of consistent non-threatening behavior to move the same person from threatening to safe. The asymmetry is the same one that governs trust building in general. The stakes of a false negative, of classifying a threat as safe, are higher than the stakes of a false positive. So the system is more conservative in the direction that matters more. A person who frightened a swan last spring, and who has since spent months approaching correctly and giving appropriate space, may find that the bird's response has barely shifted. The data accumulating in the safe direction is being compared against the data already on file in the threatening direction. It takes longer to overcome than it took to create. In some cases, at some level of severity in the original threatening encounters, the reclassification never fully completes. The swan remembers, not out of stubbornness, out of accuracy. Number 5. What you are transmitting that you do not know you are transmitting. This is the section that tends to stay with people. The behavioral profile the swan builds on you is not limited to your deliberate behavior. It includes everything your body does in the bird's presence, including the things you have no conscious control over and no awareness of producing. Gait pattern. The particular rhythm of your walk is individually specific in ways that you cannot modify without deliberate and sustained effort. The swan that has seen you walk toward it 20 times knows your walk, not as a conscious identification, as a pattern in its recognition system that is activated by the specific timing and movement signature your walk produces. You cannot approach a swan you have a history with in a disguise that extends to your gait without the swan registering that something about the familiar pattern is wrong. Breathing rate and movement quality. Anxiety produces physiological changes that affect movement. Elevated heart rate changes the micro-tremors in muscle control. Stress affects the fluidity of movement in ways that are subtle but measurable. A swan that has seen you calm and loose on a dozen visits will notice, at some level of its processing, that your movement quality is different on the day you are nervous about something, even if you are trying not to show it. It cannot identify what has changed, but it can identify that something has. This is not mysticism, it is sensory sensitivity, applied to a rich behavioral signal. Birds have visual acuity and motion processing speed that makes human perceptual capability look coarse by comparison. The information available to a swan watching a human approach is not the information available to another human watching the same approach. It is more detailed, more temporally resolved, and processed by a system that has been calibrated across this bird's entire life to extract threat-relevant signal from behavioral noise. What you are transmitting when you approach a swan is not the controlled, edited presentation you think you are making. It is the full signal. Everything your body is doing. Everything your history with this bird has established as the baseline. Everything that deviates from that baseline today. The swan is not judging your intentions. It never was. It is reading your signal. All of it. The parts you know about and the parts you do not. And it is doing so with an accuracy that most people who have ever stood at the edge of a lake and felt, inexplicably, that the swan in front of them knew something they had not said, were not wrong about. The swan did know something. It knew what you were transmitting. It has always known. The question that stays with me, and that I think is worth sitting with, is this. If you could see the profile the swan at your local lake has built on you, the complete behavioral record, every visit, every approach, every signal you sent without knowing you sent it, what would it say? Not what you intended it to say, what it actually says. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment at a swan lake where the bird's response to you felt specific, felt personal, felt like it was responding to something you did not consciously do? Tell me exactly what happened. Tell me what the swan did and what you felt it knew. I read every one.